In 2011, role-playing fans banded together to fight for the release of 3 games on Nintendo's Wii console: The Last Story, Pandora's Tower, and Xenoblade Chronicles. It was known as Operation Rainfall, and it was a success. All 3 games made their way to the Wii in the West, but it was Xenoblade that perhaps found the greatest success. It was the only one published by Nintendo itself, and its moderate success led to multiple sequels and a re-release on the new Nintendo 3DS. Now, 10 years after its original Japanese release, Xenoblade has returned as Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition for Nintendo Switch. This is effectively a remaster of the original Wii game enhanced using the engine powering Xenoblade Chronicles 2, but there are caveats to this approach. Today we'll check out what the Definitive Edition brings to the table, stacking the game up against the original Wii release and the new 3DS version, while also examining performance and visuals in both handheld and docked mode. Plus, what's up with the resolution? Let's get into it. If it wasn't clear from the name, the Definitive Edition is designed to offer the best Xenoblade experience. It features enhanced visuals, a remastered soundtrack, new content, a revamped UI, and more. And it's true, at first glance, the visual upgrade here is significant and there are a ton of changes, but if you dig deeper, it becomes evident that perhaps this isn't as large an update as we first expected. Firstly though, let's talk about resolution. Information about this has been floating around for a few days now, and I can confirm via pixel counts that it works exactly as was reported. Basically, it's just like Xenoblade Chronicles 2. That means in docked mode the game maxes out at 720p, but can drop to 504p in some instances, while in portable mode it tops out at 540p with dips to 378p in the low end. So what does that mean for this game then? Well, unfortunately, like Xenoblade 2, the image quality is not great. The game is rather soft, even compared to your typical Switch release. It's sharper than any previous version of Xenoblade, of course, but the leap isn't as significant as hoped. At least the sharpening feature has been adjusted, so it's no longer anywhere near as ugly as it was in portable mode in the last game, so that's a good thing. Still, while it's not optimal, it doesn't ruin the experience or anything, and it does seem to hold a higher resolution more often than Xenoblade 2. It's just kind of disappointing considering the rest of the package. Now, before we delve into the comparisons with the original versions though, you might also be curious about docked versus portable mode. It's pretty straightforward really. Beyond the image quality variation, some visual tweaks were made as well, namely, screen space reflections used on bodies of water in docked mode are eliminated when played in portable mode. Secondly, distant point lights are drawn further out into the distance while playing in docked mode and reined in portable. The other major difference lies in the shadow resolution. Shadows are pared back when played in portable mode, lower resolution and lacking the definition you see in docked mode. Pay special attention to the shadow beneath Shulk. So it's basically a slight reduction in visual quality plus a lower resolution, but still, it does look better than Xenoblade Chronicles 2 did in portable mode due to the reduced sharpening, so it has that going for it. But really, it was the comparison with the original game that is perhaps most interesting to me. After all, the Wii hardware itself was derived from the GameCube, which was engineered starting in the 90s. So it's kind of insane to think that a game this massive and beautiful was developed for that hardware platform in the first place. Now the Switch is far removed from that architecture and has proven much more capable as you'd expect, so we expected huge improvements. Let's kick off right from the beginning with the game's beautiful introduction sequence then. It certainly makes a nice first impression. There's a clear jump in quality, but you might be wondering what's actually changed. Well, there are a few key areas where the visuals have changed since the Wii original. First and foremost, we have the textures. Most of the game's textures have been either reworked entirely or touched up. In some cases, normal maps are now used, revealing additional surface detail. Specular highlights now play off the surface in a more realistic manner, something especially noticeable on mechanical objects. As you play, this generally has the effect of increasing perceived detail across the world, as surfaces now hold up much better under close scrutiny, at least to a reasonable degree, as not every texture has been updated. But most of them have, so it looks better overall. One of the more noticeable omissions, though, applies to things like Shulk's clothing here in this scene. You can see that some detail around the scene has been changed, but his clothing still looks similar to the Wii original, which is kind of out of place. It's a mixed bag overall then. The increase in texture detail is welcome, but it doesn't apply to everything, yet what has changed doesn't spoil the appearance of the game. The art is still intact. The next noticeable upgrade stems from updated polygon models. While certain elements of the scenery have been improved with more polygons, something noticeable here in this shot, it's really the characters that benefit most, but mainly just the faces and the hands. You see, each main character has received a literal facelift with a huge increase in geometric complexity and overall improvements to shading. Hands also have individual fingers now, which is very useful in cutscenes, while overall character detail elsewhere is only updated slightly. I think it's an improvement overall, but it does somewhat change the look of the characters in a way that not every fan will enjoy. The original characters have an almost Vagrant Story-like aesthetic, while the new game is much more anime. It's definitely more detailed, but is it better? That's up to the individual. Now, other improvements made to the game's rendering includes proper shadow maps, which naturally lend the world additional depth, though shadows are fixed in place and do not seem to update with time of day. There were attempts to simulate shadows from large objects in the original Wii version, but they were much more imprecise and nowhere near as nice looking as what we see in the new version of the game. Also, as I mentioned earlier, screen space reflections have been added to the mix, but are only present in docked mode. They look good enough, but exhibit the typical limitations faced when using screen space reflections on large bodies of water, namely visible clipping along the sides. There's also work done with the game's lighting. There's an attempt at simulating light shafts and volumetric lighting in the game, which looks pretty good, but is also relatively basic. Certain scenes also exhibit evidence of bounce lighting, with the green hue from the grass influencing the colors of objects placed around it. This is very likely a rather simple baked solution, but it does bring additional depth to the visuals, and I feel it looks really nice. Another great feature is the inclusion of per-pixel motion blur for dramatic actions. It's most visible during cutscenes, but can be observed within the game as well when the camera quickly parallaxes with the scenery. So thus far, I think it's fair to say that overall, the game is looking better on Switch, but there are a few areas where it perhaps falls a tad short. For instance, I noticed that trees are now much more static on the Switch. In the original Wii version, tree branches are actually animated, but now on Switch, they are completely static, which is bizarre as a lot of work was clearly poured into updating the actual tree models themselves. There also remains an issue with the drawl distance of the game's foliage, which visibly pops into view on Switch. Now, of course, it's the same story over on Wii, but the lower resolution helps hide this a little better. As a result, it's almost more distracting on Switch, especially when exploring large open fields like this, where there's a very obvious line at which foliage begins to draw. Everything after that is somewhat flat and blurred. Still, despite these issues, I do feel it's generally an improvement over the original Wii version, just not to the degree I expected. It's still very clearly a game from 2010, specifically a Wii game. In comparison, Xenoblade Cross on Wii U is a much better looking game overall, well, except for the character models, which I've never really liked. Of course, if we bring in the 3DS version of the game, it's a lot more difficult to complain, as the leap is, simply put, massive. The fact that this game was converted to the 3DS at all is kind of a miracle in and of itself, and likely why it requires the new 3DS hardware specifically, but that doesn't mean it looks great. The low 400 by 240 resolution of the 3DS just doesn't play nicely with large-scale worlds like this. It was already a step down from the original Wii release upon release, and that's doubly true here, but I really still can't be too harsh on it due to the platform on which it launched. It's a remarkably impressive conversion. Really, the main issue with the 3DS version stems primarily from texture fidelity reduction across the board, which leads to blurry surfaces throughout the game. While the small screen and low resolution help hide this to some degree, it's still painfully obvious during gameplay. Now, if we step back, I do think it's fair to say that the definitive edition does live up to its name, but with the qualifier that it's perhaps not quite the leap I had expected. Yes, it looks better, but it's not a night and day difference. This is primarily due to the rather low output resolution and plethora of Wii quality assets peppered throughout. Still, despite all this, Xenoblade Chronicles remains a beautiful game, and that is still true in the Switch version. Honestly, the fact that it looks as good as it does says a lot about the original development team's effort back on the Wii. So with these comparisons out of the way, I guess the next question then is one of performance, and this is relatively straightforward as well. Now, I haven't had time to play that far into the Switch version, but during my time with the game, I can say that it does hold 30 frames per second most of the time. Dynamic resolution scaling is generally used to pick up the slack. Well, most of the time. You see, on some occasions I ran into issues like this, where the frame rate would drop momentarily while the DRS system catches up. Now, it's pretty minor in the grand scheme of things, but it is there. Now, of course, it's difficult to say if things will change later in the game. This is a very long game indeed, but based on my experience thus far, it should be mostly smooth throughout. I wouldn't expect any major surprises here. The same is true of portable mode, which exhibits the same mostly consistent level of performance, albeit at a lower resolution. So when it comes to performance, there really isn't anything that sticks out as an issue here. It really is a stable 30 frames per second most of the time, and does not interfere with gameplay. Still, it's disappointing that the game needs to utilize dynamic resolution so frequently to keep the performance at 30 frames per second. So it's adequate, but not exceptional in this department.
Shoot!
But aside from performance and visual upgrades, what else can you expect then? Well, the user interface is another key area where the game has been greatly improved. The entirely new UI is so much more user-friendly and more attractive than the original game. There's also remastered music throughout the game, which is nice, though you do have the option to toggle this in the menu, and there's even new content. So the big takeaway here is that Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition is a rather nice remaster that does not go above and beyond, in the same way that something like Saints Row the Third Remastered does. It's a solid but relatively average effort. But that's not necessarily a bad thing in this case. You see, it's still a significant improvement over the original game in most areas, and since that original game is of such high quality, it is a wonderful way to either revisit the game or play it for the first time. Xenoblade Chronicles remains one of the finest role-playing games Nintendo has published over the years, and no matter how you slice it, I definitely recommend giving it a shot. Just don't go into this expecting a full-on visual remake. But that's gonna do it for this video. If you enjoyed it, as always, be sure to give us a like and subscribe, ring the notification bell for instant updates from Digital Foundry, check out our Patreon, and of course, come find us over on Twitter to discuss whatever's on your mind. But until next time, this is John, signing off.